There are a lot of different emotional intelligence tests out there. Some are rigorous and valid, and some just aren't. And so I'm going to explain to you what makes a good emotional intelligence test. In the notes, we'll drop a link to a comparison of some different emotional intelligence tests that we have looked at and that might help you if you're trying to go further into choosing an emotional intelligence test to use for yourself or in your work. All right, if you're serious about emotional intelligence, then you need a serious tool. So if you're going to be exploring different emotional intelligence tests, you really need to understand a little bit about this concept of validity and what makes a psychometric test different than a magazine quiz. So basically, in a magazine quiz, you get whatever results you want. You take it 10 times, you get 10 completely different answers. You say, okay, I'm going to take this, and this time I want to be more over here. You can make it give you the results you want. In a real psychometric test, it's pretty hard to game. Now, you might have some differences, and they change over time. And particularly in self-assessments, there, as I said, in self-assessments and 360s, there is an element of subjectivity, and so they will change. But there's it's kind of underlying stability that is sometimes called test-retest validity, which says, this person said their strength was this, and then they take it 3 months later, and has it completely changed, and now you're saying their strength is their weakness? That's probably an indicator of a validity issue. There's another type of validity, which is called face validity. And this is in some way the most simplistic idea, but for most of us, it's one of the most important. It depends what you're trying to do with the test. But if you're going to give somebody a test, and then you're going to work with them on the results, and they're going to look at it, they look at this report and they say, this makes no sense, and this has nothing to do with me. You're going to have a very hard time meeting them where they are and helping them grow. So face validity simply means that somebody looks at the questions and goes, yeah, you said this was an emotional intelligence test. I can see why you're asking me these questions. They kind of make sense to me. I look at this report and you say, this is a report about your emotional intelligence. I go, oh, okay, yeah, there's stuff about intelligence here and there's stuff about emotions. I remember David Crusoe, who's the co-author of one of the most famous emotional intelligence tests, saying to me, at a minimum, if it's going to be called an emotional intelligence test, let's make sure it deals with emotions and intelligence. Now that sounds silly, but there are a lot of tests out there that are marketed as emotional intelligence tests. And when you go through the questions, you'll find, out of 100 questions, there are like 3 that have anything to do with emotion. And, so if we're going to be in this realm of emotional intelligence, at least make sure that just looking at the questions and looking at the report, we're talking about the intelligent use of emotion. And that's going to be key in face validity. People are going to get this report back and you're going to have a conversation with them and they'll go, okay, I can talk to you about this. Particularly for a concept that's a little bit unusual and maybe a little challenging for some people, face validity is actually quite important. So the other part of validity that's going to be useful to you is technically called construct validity, and it's actually not that complicated an idea. It's very complicated to do. I've gone through this process a lot of times because I've been part of building 9 different psychometric assessments and 8 variations so far of one of them. And when you're building an assessment, what happens is you have an idea, like, okay, we're going to ask these questions and they're going to fit together into a construct and they're going to make sense. And then you get the data back from the research team and you say, it didn't work. And now you can be a good test builder or a bad test builder. If you're a bad test builder, what you're going to do is say, force fit it. I don't really care if the statistics are great. I like the way these questions work. What's in my head makes sense. Just let's make it work. The problem with that is, of course, you're sort of subverting the whole point of this validation process. And I've worked with some statisticians that are obsessive about this in a very good way. But we have to balance the academic part of this work with the practical part of this work. When you're being a good test builder, what happens is you say, this item, I thought it fit here, but mathematically it doesn't. And as you start to build more and more of a norm base, and I'll explain what that is in a minute and why it matters, but as you start building more people taking the assessment and getting more and more data, you have to go through this process over and over. And this is why good emotional intelligence tests are insanely expensive to create. Because as you start using them more and more and more, you have to keep revalidating over and over. And there are a lot of tests on the market commercially where they've done one validation with a group of university students, published the test, and 10 years later they're still using the same data. So if you're going to be serious about using one of these tools and you're going to really count on it as part of your practice or your professional work, you need one that's being updated on a regular basis and that there's a seriousness. But you don't need an academic tool unless you are an academic and you're trying to say, like, we're trying to really differentiate finely between these two very narrow concepts. In the real world, for most of us, what we want is something that has good structural validity, good construct validity, where there's been sufficient testing to say, these questions work together. Each question has a good range of responses. Each question performs in a psychometrically appropriate way. These questions cluster together into a concept. These concepts cluster together into a bigger concept. And we take this big, complicated thing called emotional intelligence and we break it down into a model that's meaningful. And this, to me, is one of the most important questions. When you're looking at construct validity, it's not enough to be a good statistician. I've worked with amazing psychometricians, and they can down to a gnat's hair say, like, these things work and these things work and these things work. But what's the meaning? And a good construct will have an inherent meaningfulness when you kind of poke at it and you say, how does this fit with this? There's a logic to it that's supported both mathematically and rationally for us real humans. So that's a lot to take in. But the bottom line is there sufficient research that's ongoing with this tool for you to say, I can rely on the results. This is not just a magazine quiz. One of the essential parts of that is something called norming. And what norming means is that we're going to take these questions and we're going to have a bunch of people take them. And we're going to do a bunch of math tricks and we're going to create a norm base to which we're going to compare everybody. Now, this is essential, and it's the underpinning of a good test. Because if you don't have a good norm base that represents the population you're working with, you're comparing people with this population that's not them. Again, there are a lot of tests out there where there's a very small norm base or norm base that's very selectively chosen. University students. We have this group of university students, and then we're going to say, yeah, this chairman's of the board, we're going to compare them to these university students. Does that really make sense? We need a norm base that's culturally, educationally representative of the population that we're trying to assess. And to be culturally competent and to think about this from a global perspective, if you're working all over the world, you must have a tool that has an international norm base that's robust and in some way matching the population you're working with. One more thing about norms that's important is that when you effectively norm an assessment, it means that when different people take it, the questions have a meaningfulness between the questions and between people. And when I first started learning about this, I really didn't understand this. And I assumed that, a 4 was better than a 3. But let's just suppose I ask you, how good are you at parallel parking? Let's say you say that we have a group of people. The average score in this group of people, let's just say it's a 4.25. And then I ask another question, which is something like, how good are you at using a GPS? And let's just suppose that the answer to that is 4.5. Which is better, 4.25 for this group or 4.5 for this other group? Well, you might think you know, but you're assuming these two questions are mathematically equivalent. And when we go through a norming process, what we see is, what is the baseline for this question? What is the baseline for this question? And we can modify the norms for each question in order to have a baseline of comparison so that we know whether 4.25 is above the average or not? I mean, because what if one of the questions, the average was 2, and the other question, the average was 4.9? Then all of a sudden, the score has a very different meaning. In order to create a basis of comparison, we need good norms. And this is actually an intensely complex process. This is why good assessments can't just be self-scored. Good assessments use an incredibly complicated algorithm that would take a human being hours to compute. And some have artificial intelligence under them. Some have thousands of computations that are being done in order to come up with this one piece of paper that gives you something meaningful, and that your meaningful data is something that you can count on and compare to this other person's meaningful data. So that's the essence of validation, and why it's so important that you go through this process and you choose a tool that has this robustness, because you're measuring something serious. You want to have enough seriousness behind it, and you want it to make sense in the real world.